Most people misunderstand empaths. They assume because someone understands deeply, they will tolerate deeply. Because someone feels everything, they will forgive everything. That assumption is where the mistake begins. An empath is not emotionally fragile. They are emotionally precise. They notice what others ignore. They feel what others suppress. They remember what others pretend didn't happen. And when you break that trust, something subtle but permanent shifts. At first, nothing seems different. They still smile. They still listen. They still respond. But what you don't see is the internal recalibration. Access levels are changing. Emotional doors are closing not loudly but quietly. Not with anger but with clarity. Because an empath doesn't break loudly. They shut down access silently. And here's the critical point most people miss. You don't lose an empath when they leave. You lose them when they stop feeling safe with you. From that moment forward, you are no longer inside their emotional world the same way. You are observed, not absorbed. Acknowledged, not embraced. People think they can repair it with apologies, words, time. But emotional trust doesn't regenerate on demand. It rebuilds only under consistent proof, and most people never realize how much consistency it actually takes. So what happens after? You experience the absence. Not dramatic absence, not obvious absence, but emotional absence while they are still physically present. And that is what makes it powerful, because you start remembering what it felt like when they were fully there. And now you're only getting fragments of that presence. Here's the final truth. An empath doesn't seek revenge. They don't need to. Their departure from emotional investment is the consequence. And once they detach, you don't get the same version back. Not fully. Not honestly. Not like before. So the message is simple, not emotional. If you have an empath in your life, don't test their limits. Don't assume depth means durability. And don't mistake patience for permanence. Because when an empath breaks inside, they don't explode outward, they disappear inward. And what comes after that silence is not punishment. It is absence of something you can never replace the same way again. An empath is not simply someone who is emotional or sensitive. In a casual sense, they are a deeply attuned psychological processor who constantly reads emotional data from their environment at a level most people never consciously access. This means they pick up on tone shifts, microexpressions, energy changes, and inconsistencies between words and behavior, often without being able to turn this awareness off. When you interact with an empath, you are not just communicating information, you are transmitting emotional signals that they automatically interpret, store, and integrate into their understanding of you. Because of this heightened perception, trust for an empath is not built on what you say alone, but on a continuous pattern of emotional safety they feel in your presence. If that safety is disrupted through betrayal, manipulation, inconsistency, or emotional neglect, the impact is not just a temporary reaction. It becomes a long-term internal adjustment in how they relate to you. They don't usually respond with immediate confrontation or visible aggression, because their natural tendency is to observe, process, and recalibrate rather than explode. Instead, what happens internally is a quiet restructuring of emotional axis like a system, gradually lowering permissions based on repeated risk signals. At first, you may not notice any change because empaths are highly skilled at maintaining social harmony even while they are internally shifting. They may still engage, still respond, and still appear present, but the depth of emotional openness begins to reduce subtly. This is not a conscious act of punishment, it is a psychological defense mechanism designed to prevent further emotional damage. Over time, the empath begins to detach emotionally while remaining physically or socially available, which creates a confusing experience for the other person, who may assume everything is still normal. In reality, the empath is no longer processing the relationship with the same emotional investment. They have moved from deep connection to cautious observation. Once this shift solidifies, it becomes extremely difficult to reverse because the empath system now requires consistent long-term evidence of safety before it considers reopening that emotional depth again. Simple apologies or short-term behavioral changes are not enough, because the empath's memory of emotional patterns carries more weight than isolated moments of regret. This is why relationships with empaths often feel like they quietly fade rather than abruptly end. The disconnection happens internally long before it becomes visible externally. And when the final emotional withdrawal occurs, is not dramatic or loud, it is a complete reduction of emotional availability to a point where the person who once had deep access now only receives surface-level interaction. The most important thing to understand is that this is not revenge or punishment, it is preservation. The empath is not trying to hurt the other person, they are simply protecting their internal emotional stability by removing unsafe access. Once this state is reached, the connection does not return to its original form, because emotional trust, once structurally broken at that depth, does not reset to previous conditions. It can only be rebuilt into something new, slower, and more cautious, and in many cases it is never fully restored to what it once was. When an empath is emotionally hurt, the most important thing to understand is that their reaction is not immediate chaos on the outside, but structured change on the inside. They do not simply get over it or forget what happened. Instead, they begin a deep, internal analysis of the emotional pattern that caused the injury. Every interaction afterward is processed through the lens of that experience. This is because empaths rely heavily on emotional consistency to feel safe in a relationship. Once that consistency is broken, their mind starts building protective filters that slowly reduce the level of emotional access the other person had before. At first, this change is almost invisible. They may still laugh, talk normally, and even show warmth. But internally, they are no longer fully open. They are watching more than feeling. They are listening more than trusting. Their emotional system is shifting from connection mode to evaluation mode, where every new action is compared against past behavior. This is not something they consciously decide. It is an automatic survival response developed through emotional intelligence and repeated exposure to inconsistency. The key point here is that the empath is not reacting to a single moment, but to a pattern of emotional safety or danger. One mistake might be forgiven, but repeated emotional disruptions create a permanent recalibration in how they perceive the person responsible. Over time, this leads to a noticeable reduction in emotional availability. They stop sharing deeply. They stop investing emotionally at the same level. They become more reserved, more observant, and more internally distant, even if they remain physically present in the relationship. This gradual withdrawal is often misunderstood by others as they are just busy or they are fine now, but in reality, the empath has already started detaching emotionally long before any confrontation happens. The reason this process is so powerful is because it is not driven by anger or impulse, but by analysis and emotional intelligence. Once the empath's internal system decides that a certain emotional environment is unsafe, it does not revert easily. Trust is not rebuilt through words, it is rebuilt through consistent behavior over time, and many people underestimate how long and how stable that consistency must be. As a result, what looks like normal communication on the surface is actually a relationship that is slowly losing depth underneath. In the second stage of this emotional shift, the empath enters a phase where detachment becomes more defined and irreversible in practical terms. This is where most people realize too late that the connection they once had is no longer accessible in the same way. The empath begins to emotionally downsize the relationship, meaning they reduce the level of intimacy, vulnerability, and emotional investment they previously offered. They still interact, but the interaction becomes controlled, measured, and self-protective. This is not because they want to punish the other person, but because they have learned through emotional experience that full openness without safety leads to harm. At this stage, attempts to fix things quickly, such as apologies without behavioral change, emotional appeals, or temporary kindness, do not have the same effect they once would have had. The empath is no longer responding to isolated moments, they are responding to the entire emotional history. This is why repair feels difficult and slow. The internal system is now prioritizing stability over connection, safety over closeness. Even if the empath cares deeply, they will not allow themselves to return to the previous level of vulnerability unless they see sustained evidence that the emotional environment has fundamentally changed. And even then, the rebuilt connection is not identical, it is more cautious, more aware, and less open than before. This is where the idea of regret after becomes relevant, not in a dramatic sense, but in a psychological one. The other person often realizes the value of the empath only when the depth is gone, when emotional warmth has been replaced by distance, and when access to genuine emotional understanding is no longer freely available. At that point, what has been lost is not just attention or presence, but a rare form of emotional connection that cannot simply be recreated on demand. When an empath experiences emotional harm, the third phase of their internal response is the most misunderstood because it is no longer about reaction, it is about permanent restructuring of emotional identity within the relationship. At this stage, the empath has already processed the emotional event, analyzed the pattern behind it, and concluded whether the environment is safe or unsafe for continued deep emotional investment. What happens next is not visible drama, but silent recalibration at a deeper psychological level. The empath begins to redefine who the other person is in their internal emotional map. This is crucial because empaths do not interact only with present behavior, they also carry an internal emotional record of every consistent pattern they have experienced. Once that record is updated with unsafe or inconsistent, their emotional system automatically limits access, regardless of surface-level apologies or temporary improvements. This is why many people are confused when an empath seems different. After a certain point, they are not reacting emotionally anymore, they are operating from a revised emotional framework. In this stage, the empath becomes highly selective with energy investment. They no longer give emotional depth freely, instead, they ration it carefully based. It's on proven consistency over time. Even conversations that once felt intimate now feel more controlled and less emotionally open. The empath may still care, but care is no longer equal to access. This distinction is critical. Emotional attachment may remain, but emotional availability decreases significantly. What others interpret as distance or coldness is actually structured self-protection built through experience, not sudden mood change. The empath is essentially ensuring that the same emotional injury does not repeat itself under the same conditions. Because of this, they begin to detach from expectations. They stop anticipating emotional reciprocity from the same level they once did, and instead adjust their internal expectations downward to match reality. This adjustment is not reversible through emotion alone. It requires sustained behavioral evidence that the original emotional harm will not be repeated. Without that evidence, the empath remains in a protected state, where they engage but do not fully open. As this third phase deepens, the emotional gap between the empath and the other person becomes more noticeable, but often only to those who are sensitive enough to recognize it. On the surface, life may continue normally, messages are exchanged, interactions happen, and routines remain intact, but the emotional weight behind those interactions is no longer the same. The empath is no longer emotionally investing in the relationship with the same depth, and this creates a quiet imbalance. One side may still be expecting closeness, while the other side has already reduced emotional participation. This mismatch is where regret begins to form, because the loss is not immediate or dramatic, it is gradual and subtle, making it harder to recognize until the depth is already gone. The empath in this stage is focused on emotional efficiency, meaning they invest only where they feel consistent safety, mutual respect, and emotional stability. Anything that previously caused harm becomes categorized as high risk, even if it is no longer actively harmful in the present moment. This categorization is important because it shows that the empath's response is not based on emotion alone, but on learned emotional intelligence and pattern recognition. Once a person is placed in a limited access category in their emotional system, the relationship cannot simply return to its former state through apology or regret. It requires time, consistency, behavioral proof that the emotional environment has fundamentally changed. In many cases, the empath may still remain polite, kind, or even helpful, but the emotional depth that once defined the connection is no longer available in the same way. This is where the final realization occurs for the other person. They did not lose the empath's presence, they lost their emotional depth, and that depth is what made the connection meaningful in the first place. The empath, meanwhile, has already adapted to functioning without full emotional exposure in that relationship, making reversal extremely difficult. The result is a permanent shift in dynamics where the empath remains aware, composed, and present, but no longer fully accessible at the emotional level they once were. When an empath reaches the fourth and final stage of emotional processing after being hurt, what happens is not a reaction anymore, but a complete emotional closure at a structural level. This is the point where the internal system of the empath no longer attempts to repair or reevaluate the relationship in the same emotional depth as before. Instead, it finalizes a psychological boundary that separates past emotional connection from present interaction. At this stage, the empath has already collected enough emotional evidence over time to conclude that returning to previous levels of trust or openness is not safe or sustainable. This conclusion is not made impulsively, it is the result of repeated internal evaluation, observation of patterns, and emotional consistency testing. Once this boundary is formed, the empath stops treating the relationship as something that can return to its original form. Even if communication continues, the emotional meaning behind it changes completely. The empath is no longer operating from hope of restoration, but from acceptance of change. This acceptance is powerful because it removes emotional dependency from the equation entirely. The empath no longer waits for improvement in the same way, and this shift marks the beginning of true emotional independence from the situation. What remains is interaction without vulnerability, presence without deep attachment, and engagement without emotional exposure. This is often misunderstood by others as forgiveness or normalcy, but internally it is something very different. It is closure without announcement. There is no dramatic ending, no confrontation required, and no emotional explosion. Instead, there is a quiet finalization where the empath's internal system stops allocating emotional resources to the relationship at the previous level. As this closure becomes stable, The empath begins to operate with a highly refined sense of emotional boundaries. These boundaries are not visible rules but internal filters that automatically regulate how much emotional energy is given, shared, or received. At this stage, even if the other person tries to restore closeness, the empath system does not respond in the same way because the emotional pathways that once allowed deep access have been significantly restricted. This is not driven by resentment, it is driven by self-preservation and emotional learning. The empath has already understood that certain emotional patterns lead to imbalance or harm, so the mind prevents re-entry into the same vulnerable state. This creates a situation where the relationship can still exist externally but has fundamentally changed internally. Conversations may continue, interactions may remain polite, but the emotional depth layer is no longer active. The empath no longer experiences the same level of emotional immersion in the relationship, and this is where most people start to feel the real impact of their actions. They may notice that the empath is present but not emotionally reachable, engaged but not emotionally available. This shift is often mistaken for indifference, but it is actually controlled detachment developed through experience. The empath is not trying to punish anyone. They are simply ensuring emotional stability for themselves by preventing further vulnerability in a space that is already proven unsafe. Over time, this final stage becomes permanent in most cases because emotional systems are designed to prioritize stability once a pattern of harm has been recognized. The empath does not constantly reopen emotional wounds for the sake of revisiting the past. Instead, they focus on maintaining internal balance. This means that even if the other person shows change later, the empath does not immediately return to their previous emotional state. Trust, once deeply broken, does not reset, it must be rebuilt slowly from a neutral starting point, not from where it previously left off. This is where regret often becomes most intense for the other person, because they begin to realize that access to the empath's deeper emotional self is no longer available on demand. What was once freely given understanding, emotional depth, patience, and connection now exists only in limited form or not at all. The empath, however, is no longer emotionally dependent on the outcome. They have already adapted internally to function without full emotional investment in that connection. This adaptation is what makes the change feel irreversible, because the empath is no longer operating from emotional need but from emotional awareness and protection. At this point, even if reconciliation occurs, the dynamic is permanently altered and the relationship can never return to its original intensity. In the final realization of this process, the most important truth becomes clear. The empath was never weak for feeling deeply, but strong enough to protect what they feel once it was misused. The closure they create is not an act of revenge, punishment, or emotional retaliation. It is a final act of self-respect and emotional intelligence. Once they reach this stage, they no longer revisit the emotional version of the relationship that existed before the damage, because that version no longer exists within their internal system. Instead, they operate from a new emotional reality where boundaries are clear, access is limited, and trust must be proven rather than assumed. This is why the loss of an empath feels so significant after the fact. It is not just the loss of a person, but the loss of emotional depth, understanding, and presence that cannot easily be replicated.